from the fortress, prepared to fight all the way. Barking monkeys watched the column, and white vultures wheeled above the troops as they picked their way over the corpses of men and animals from the previous day. It was my first sight of dead during that war, Matthews wrote, yet I remember looking at them almost indifferently, as if I, who had undergone my baptism of fire the previous day, were accustomed to seeing dead bodies, and so riding by them unmoved. In the back of my mind there was a lurking wonder that I was not filled with pity and revolted at the horrible spectacle. The following day, the Italians occupied Asby without resistance. Matthews and Barzini visited the fortress from which Sabat had controlled the town. It was like that of a baron of the early Middle Ages. Built of stone and mud, it had no furniture apart from a few packing cases. Sabat had slept on straw. The only decoration in the main room was ox horns fitted to the walls as hooks for rifles. All this was excellent material. The testing of Italian native troops under fire, the Abyssinian tactics, the nature of the engagement, the physical surroundings, the primitive Abyssinian fortress, the inexplicable disappearance of the Abyssinian troops. Matthews and Barzini accompanied the wounded back to a field hospital, and from there they hurried to the wounded back to the field hospital. And they hurried to Asmar to follow their stories. Barzini telephoned a short account to Corriere della Sera, which printed on November 19th. Matthews, who still considers that his best story of the war, wrote non-stop for 11 hours. It took the inadequate Italian radio 2 days to transmit his report, cost $1,500 in cable tolls, and on November 23rd was spread over 16 columns on the front page and 2 whole inside pages, the longest single story by a correspondent in the New York Times had ever published. This, and the other pieces Matthews wrote during that same period, carried a clear indication of his sympathies, and he was promptly accused of being a fascist. First, it is important to remember that in 1935, fascism was respectable political philosophy to many, and Mussolini had admirers, including, for example, Winston Churchill. Matthews' attitude, which he is still prepared frankly to admit at the time of publishing, was that he admired the Italians, admired the fascists, and knew that they were going to win. The right or wrong of it did not interest me greatly, not any more, let us say, than did Laval, the French foreign minister, Eden, and Standard Oil Company. If you start from the premise that a lot of rascals are having a fight, it is not unnatural to want to see the victory of the rascal you like, and I liked Italians during the scrimmage more than I did the British or the Abyssinians. Webb Miller of the United Press, who was originally bitter about the Italian invasion, came to feel the same and included in his book a chapter called The Case for the Aggressor. Then it should be remembered that there was, in the attitude of many correspondents covering the war, a flavor of grand adventure, of European civilizing mission to a barbaric and backward country. Even the cool-headed Matthews succumbed. He was 35 years old, as he wrote, "Nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita," in the midst of this, our mortal life, and he was attracted by the glamorous image of war. Stepping out of my tent under the over-full moon while the camp was fast asleep, except the sentries whose fires twinkled along the crest of the scene, a sense of timelessness of what came over me. Caesar's legions had made such marches in conquering Gaul and set up just such camps with sentry fires gleaming around them. There was the same moon, the same urge to conquest, the same thrill of adventure, life and death and history in the making, whether it be de bello gallico or just a hasty narrative for one day's newspaper. Matthews had admitted, "I was not concerned with moral or ethical problems. They grew with time and experience and thought as the wars took on a political shape and the wanton, wicked, vicious quality of the suffering imposed on others seared its way into my heart." But in 1935 to 1936, in sympathy with the Italians and moved by war's glamour, what did he report? For the first 2 months following his End Gorge experience, he was unable to report anything. The new commander, Marshal Pietro Beldoglio, decided to impose a rigid censorship, which he enforced by keeping the correspondents cooped up in Asmara for 10 long weeks until he was ready to move against the Abyssinians again. There were no facilities for sports, and, in any case, the altitude made any form of exercise difficult. There were no cabarets, nightclubs, or English cinemas. There were no English books, newspapers, or magazines. The press corps dwindled. Some left in time to avoid breakdowns. Others were recalled by their newspapers. Others fell ill and had to be evacuated. Matthews, Reynolds Packard, who had replaced Webb Miller on the United Press, Christopher Holm of Reuters, and Eddie Neal of the Associated Press made up a bridge of 4 and played from 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. to stop us from going mad. By Christmas, the 150 correspondents who had originally been with the Italians the rest comprised 3 and 1 Englishman. Then, in late January 1936, Marshal Badoglio was ready for a new push. Matthews sent to the New York Times dispatches that said the Italians were going to win. Due weight was not given to his opinion because of his sympathies, while undue weight was given to reports from Addis Ababa, because most newspaper editors wanted the Abyssinians to win, and they allowed their professional judgment to be weakened by their emotions. The Battle of Enderta, fought on February 5th, 1936, was a typical example. It was clear Italian victory and marked the beginning of the Abyssinian collapse. Matthews was there, and he wrote of what he saw. Steer, who represented the New York Times through an arrangement with the Times, was in Addis Ababa. He wrote a dispatch quoting Abyssinian sources which said that there had been several local engagements, but no battle. Steer's story was believed. Matthews was not. As he later said, "I thought that since I had seen the battle and Steer had not, my account should be accepted, and that it would be clear that this was going to be the fate of Haile Selassie's other armies. I was wrong." Even the British military expert, Captain, later Sir Basil Little Hart, in assessing the significance of the battle in articles of the Times and the New York Times, wrote of the lack of any impartial... You are just doing a little dance, aren't you? Witnesses, and the need to penetrate the present rosy haze of the cold light of reason, and the need to... Then he went on to write that there was no hint of a decisive victory. Within 10 weeks, the Italians were in Addis Ababa and the war over. The refusal to believe correspondents who wrote that the Italians were winning led to a frantic search for explanations when it became clear that they were. The easiest and most feasible explanation to hand was that the Italians were using gas and were bombing hospitals, Red Cross stations, and civilian targets. There is no doubt that the Italians used mustard gas on several occasions, but so confusing were the reports of its use, and so vehement were the Italian official denials, that as late as 1939, 4 years after the war, Evelyn Waugh was still successfully putting down anyone who suggested that gas had been employed. Waugh was attending an officer's course at the Deal in winter of 1939 to 1940. At a lecture on passive air defense, the instructor said, "The gas was used by the Italians in Abyssinia." "What evidence do you have that Italians used gas?" Waugh demanded, and the instructor was forced to admit that he had none. Yet Ladislas Farrago, on a freelance assignment for the New York Times, reported having been the victim of an Italian gas attack in northern Abyssinia, and various Red Cross officials examined gas victims and submitted evidence to the League of Nations in Geneva. Italian officers told Herbert Matthews that the Italian army was using gas. Captain Roland Strunk, an officer of the German High Command, who was an observer with the Italian forces, saw gas used and wrote a report, and Waugh, despite his later attitude, wrote in 1936, "Gas was used but accounted for only 18 lives." George Steer, writing for the Times and the New York Times, reported the statements of Red Cross officials in some detail on March 25th and again on April 3rd and 4th. The April 3rd report was perhaps the most damning. Dr. J.W.S. McPhee stated yesterday that he had personally seen and treated between March 1st and 18th several hundred men, women, and children suffering from mustard gas burns. This writer and correspondents of British newspapers have seen and photographed gas cases in the Korean area. More photographic evidence would undoubtedly have helped prove the Abyssinian charge, but the photographers covering the war worked under great difficulties. Without freedom of movement, they were forced to pose photographs behind the lines. Matthews has estimated that all of the photographs published of the war, 99 out of 100, had been faked. As was seen during the First World War, atrocity stories about the bombing of hospitals and Red Cross units are easy to level and hard to disprove. Hospitals are shelled and bombed in wartime, but how often this is done is deliberately is another matter. In Abyssinia, the question was complicated by three main factors. In sparsely inhabited terrain, Red Cross stations were inevitably near or within a military encampment. Then, the bombing techniques the Italians used were far from accurate. Moreover, the Abyssinians did not have the strict respect for the Red Cross emblem necessary to make conventions about its use workable, no doubt due to the fact that Abyssinia had a Red Cross for centuries been used to designate a brothel. When the Abyssinians learned that the Red Cross emblem conferred some immunity from bombing, they took to sheltering in Red Cross tents during attacks, and, as the next logical step, to flying Red Cross flags over their officers' headquarters. In turn, the Italians felt justified in attacking such encampments, especially when they were fired upon, even though the tents may have been marked by a Red Cross. Steer and his colleagues in Addis Ababa regularly filed details of those attacks. Matthews and his colleagues regularly filed the Italian versions of what had occurred in the Italian countercharges that the Abyssinians were using dum-dum bullets and had decapitated prisoners, both allegations probably being true, But in the emotional atmosphere surrounding the Abyssinian cause, the Italian case always passed unnoticed. It is clear in retrospect what Emperor Haile Selassie's strategy was. He knew from the beginning that Abyssinia would be no match for Mussolini, and that his main chance of avoiding the Italian occupation of his country would be to arouse the international public opinion, principally represented by the League of Nations, by projecting an image of a brave but primitive country resisting to the last mechanized might of Italy. In this strategy, every bombing of a Red Cross camp, it is significant that the Emperor complained to the League about this on the first day of the war. Every mustard gas victim, every civilian casualty was a weapon in the campaign. When it became apparent that the League was powerless and that sanctions ignored by large American oil companies would not work, and that none of the major powers, although they might be shocked by Italian atrocity stories, were prepared to intervene, Abyssinia, unable to resist the Italians militarily, collapsed around the empire and went down to the railway station in Addis Ababa and took a train into exile. The last stages of the war caught the correspondents in Addis Ababa unawares. In March 1936, British and American papers had started to give preference to news reports from the Italian front, realizing at long last that Ababa, that these gave a more accurate version of the progress of the war. But in Addis Ababa, the Abyssinians had continued to put out optimistic statements for local, if not international, consumption. Time magazine, for example, quoting the Abyssinian authorities as saying that 300,000 warriors were assembling for a massive counterattack. When the emperor fled on May 2nd, the inhabitants of Addis Ababa, realizing that they had been betrayed by the major powers, began rioting and turned on all the Europeans in the capital. Steer, who had become so involved with the Abyssinian side that he went with an official of the British legation to distribute gas masks on the northern front, and a few other correspondents sought refuge in the legation, and there, while mobs raged in the streets, he was married to Mademoiselle Marguerite de Herrero, a fellow war correspondent who had represented the Paris newspapers Le Journal. They had spent their honeymoon behind the barbed wire defenses of the legation, awaiting with some trepidation the arrival of the Italians. She died in childbirth less than a year later. 15 correspondents entered Addis Ababa with the conquering Italian forces on May 5th. Matthews, who was one of them, broke the news of the end of the war with a cable to the New York Times. Times, Roma, May 5th. Date, Addis Ababa. Matthews' era of independence that lasted since biblical times ended 4 this afternoon when Italians occupied Addis Ababa. The Italians quickly restored order and then exacted mild revenge on the correspondents who had reported the war from the Abyssinian side. They announced that only the correspondents who had arrived with them would be allowed to send dispatches. Anyone else who wished to send reports should apply to Rome in writing requesting accreditation. The 4 British correspondents had managed to send the joint dispatch on the last 2 days of the war by using the legation's radio link with Foreign Office. They now pressed the Italians for facilities to report their papers. These Italians refused, and on May 17th they expelled all 4. Within 10 days, Abyssinia had virtually disappeared from the newspapers. By then, it was the German occupation of the Rhine frontier and events in Spain that occupied the headlines. There remains one story to recount, because it captures perhaps best of all the whole Abyssinian fiasco. O.D. Gallagher, the young Daily Express reporter, had been recalled late in April, and when the war was over, he was sent to Jerusalem, where Emperor Haile Selassie was beginning his exile. His assignment was to see the emperor and offer him 6,000 pounds for his exclusive story, How I Lost the War by Haile Selassie. The emperor received Gallagher sitting on a temporary throne of satin, silver, and gilt, which had been provided by the Swiss manager of the King David Hotel. As Gallagher recalled later, his hand was in bandages. As a result, he said, of Italian mustard gas. I had to share the interview with the cameraman from Path or Paramount. The Daily Express used the interview on most of its front page, with illustrations from stills of the newsreel. The Express, getting the precedents right for its readers, if not for those who formulate royal protocol, headlined the story, Gallagher Sees Emperor. On the question of buying Haile Selassie's personal story of how he lost the war, there was no deal. Gallagher made his offer through the emperor's personal secretary, Adewolde Georges. Georges laughed. My dear Mr. Gallagher, he said, His Majesty has just refused 20,000 pounds to appear at the Dallas State Fair. To round off the Abyssinian affair, it is pleasant to record one of those historical acts of justice that seem to occur more in fiction than in real life. Haile Selassie remained in exile until 1940, when the British government decided that the emperor should be restored to his throne. To encourage the Abyssinians to rise against the Italians, a British Army intelligence unit, under the command of Colonel, later Major General, Ord Wingate, mounted what was called an offensive propaganda operation from the Sudan. As part of the operation, a British officer was delegated to accompany Haile Selassie in triumph back to Addis Ababa. The officer was George L. Steer, formerly the correspondent of the Abyssinian War for the Times. In 1936, Steer could not have known he would live to see Mussolini kicked out of Abyssinia. Bitter at the Italian victory, he returned to London to write a book exposing the Italian conduct of the war. Steer, Gallagher, Matthews, and other correspondents who have appeared in this chapter will reappear later in this book, for the Abyssinian War was the blooding of a generation of young journalists soon to become famous. Gallagher went back to the Daily Express and local news again. Matthews returned to Paris for the New York Times. None of them was home for long. In July, sovereign legionnaires in Morocco revolted, and the bloody Spanish War was underway. And that's the end of that chapter. My apologies, as always, for some of the poor accents that I do. I do my best. It helps me to not have to say quote unquote. So even if they're bad, maybe you can laugh. And if you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe. That helps me to get access to more features on YouTube to make these more easily. So thank you.